My wife, Laura, and I both worked at the same company, though we were in different departments. We had always kept our professional and personal lives separate. There was an unspoken rule between us not to bring work drama home. Occasionally, though, she'd share something interesting about her day. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, she casually mentioned a new hire in her department. "There's this new girl at work," she said, an odd excitement in her voice. "She's so fascinating. I really think you'd like her. She's got this energy about her. Really cool." I glanced up from my plate, raising an eyebrow. "Well, if you're that curious, just talk to her next time you're on break," I suggested, my tone indifferent. It was practical advice. If someone intrigues you, go find out why. A couple of days passed before she brought up the woman again. This time, there was something different about the way she spoke. "She's got some unique interests," Laura murmured, flashing me a knowing smile. I leaned back slightly, curious but not particularly concerned. "What kind of interests?" I asked, expecting to hear about an unusual hobby or an unconventional lifestyle choice. Instead, she dropped something completely unexpected. "Well, let's just say she has some very specific tastes in the bedroom." That caught me off guard. I paused, setting down my fork as I processed what she had just said. "You went from small talk to that in just 2 days?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. I wasn't angry, just baffled at how such a conversation would come up so quickly between two people who had just met. Laura shrugged as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "We're women. These things just come up," she said matter-of-factly. "It's not a big deal." I nodded, though her explanation didn't entirely sit right with me. It wasn't like I was going to start an argument over it, but something about how quickly their conversations had gone from work talk to bedroom preferences felt off. Laura wasn't the type to dive into personal subjects with a brand-new acquaintance. Later that night, while we were relaxing on the couch, she brought up the new colleague yet again. "You know, she's actually really smart," she said casually. "And she's got a sharp sense of humor, too. I think you'd like her." I just nodded, uninterested. I wasn't exactly looking to make friends with her coworkers. Work relationships were her thing, not mine. Over the next few days, Laura kept mentioning the woman, adding new details every time. Apparently, she had traveled all over, had a unique sense of style, and was full of interesting stories. I started tuning most of it out, assuming this was just another one of Laura's short-lived fascinations. She had a tendency to get really excited about new people, but it usually faded after a while. Then, out of nowhere, she said something that finally caught my attention. "You know," she mused one evening, her tone lighter than usual, "I've been thinking of doing something special. I've got a little surprise planned for you." I looked up from my phone, my curiosity piqued despite myself. "A surprise?" I asked, trying to read her expression. She gave me a mischievous smile. "Just wait. You'll see." Her words were vague, but the way she said them felt deliberate. It wasn't just some random surprise, it was something she had been thinking about. And for some reason, she seemed genuinely excited about it. I decided not to push for details. If she wanted to surprise me, I'd find out soon enough. But the way she was acting left me intrigued, and a little cautious. I wasn't a big fan of surprises, but I also didn't want to ruin her fun. Whatever it was, I'd deal with it when the time came. For now, I let her enjoy the moment, finished my dinner, and tried to push the strange feeling in my gut aside. The next day, Laura told me we were hosting a barbecue. She seemed unusually excited about it, mentioning that some of her coworkers would be coming over to discuss a project idea. She rattled off a few names, her close friend and her friend's boyfriend, along with this new colleague and her boyfriend. It sounded casual enough, so I didn't ask too many questions. I handled the preparations, heading out to grab the essentials: meat, drinks, the usual. In my mind, a barbecue was simple: good food, decent company, and nothing more than that. When everyone arrived, the atmosphere was relaxed. Laura's friend and her boyfriend showed up first, bringing a bottle of wine and a few side dishes. Not long after, the new colleague and her boyfriend walked in. My first impression of them: neutral. They were polite, but something about the way they carried themselves felt off. It was like they were too comfortable, like they already owned the space, despite just meeting me. Still, I wasn't one to jump to conclusions. We set up in the backyard, got the grill going, and everyone settled in. Drinks were passed around. Conversations flowed easily. I mostly stuck to my role as the host, making sure everything was running smoothly while Laura flitted between conversations, laughing and chatting animatedly. She was in her element, entertaining, connecting. It wasn't unusual, but something about the way she interacted with this new coworker stood out. There was a spark of excitement in her eyes every time she spoke to her. At one point, Laura clinked her glass and called for everyone's attention. "I have an idea," she announced, her enthusiasm lighting up the group. "We should all go on a hiking trip. It's the perfect way to bond, get to know each other better, and just enjoy the outdoors." I nodded in agreement. I loved hiking. It sounded like a solid plan, and I liked the idea of getting out into nature for a bit. The rest of the group seemed equally excited. They immediately started throwing out dates and discussing logistics. But as the conversation continued, I found myself paying more attention to the new colleague and her boyfriend. They had a way of subtly steering the conversation into unusual territory. They'd drop little comments, suggest topics that felt just a little too personal for a casual barbecue. And her boyfriend? He had a habit of making remarks that flirted with the line of inappropriate, never quite crossing it, but towing the edge just enough to make you notice. They clearly complemented each other in that regard. I kept my thoughts to myself, choosing to focus on grilling instead. But the more I observed, the more I felt like this wasn't just any work friend Laura had made. This woman had a pull, an influence that made people gravitate toward her. As the evening went on, the drinks kept flowing, and the conversations grew looser. Laura's friend and her boyfriend started discussing hiking trails, while the new colleague went into stories about her past adventures. Only, those adventures started to take on a more personal tone. It wasn't outright shocking, but it was enough to make me raise an eyebrow. Eventually, we settled on a date for the hiking trip. The excitement in the air was real, and everyone seemed genuinely invested in making it happen. Laura looked thrilled, pleased with how the night had gone. I stayed in the background, content to let her take the lead on this. It was her idea, after all, and she had a way of organizing things that usually worked out. As the night wound down, people started saying their goodbyes. The new colleague and her boyfriend left first, followed by Laura's friend and her partner. Once everyone was gone, the house felt eerily quiet. Laura and I cleaned up together, chatting about the trip as we gathered empty glasses and folded chairs. She seemed happy, almost giddy, as she talked about how fun the hike would be. And yet, something about this whole situation didn't sit right with me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it yet, but a nagging feeling told me this trip wasn't just about hiking. And soon, I'd find out just how right I was. The day of the hike arrived, and everyone showed up on time, buzzing with energy. We had rented all the necessary gear in advance, making sure no one was left unprepared. I double-checked everything before we set off. I wasn't about to let poor planning ruin what should have been a straightforward outdoor trip. Laura, meanwhile, was especially enthusiastic. She was moving between the group, keeping the momentum high, making sure everyone was engaged. It was like she was hosting an event rather than just enjoying a day in nature. The trail itself was beautiful. Tall trees stretched overhead, the canopy filtering sunlight and casting dappled shadows on the ground. A cool breeze made the trek more comfortable, and the steady rhythm of our footsteps on the dirt path was almost meditative. The group dynamic was light-hearted at first, filled with laughter and casual conversation. Laura's friend and her boyfriend were the most energetic, swapping stories about past hikes. The new colleague and her boyfriend lagged behind, engaged in their own hushed conversation. I stayed at the front, setting the pace, enjoying the tranquility of the forest. This was the part one loved, the escape, the disconnect from everything else. After a few hours, we found a scenic clearing and decided it was the perfect place to set up camp for a while. Everyone pitched in, laying out blankets and unpacking food. The spread was simple but satisfying: sandwiches, fruit, snacks. We sat together, eating and talking, the camaraderie growing stronger. But as evening approached, the mood shifted. As we gathered around a small fire, the conversation started drifting into deeper, more personal topics. The atmosphere was still friendly, but there was something about the way the new colleague's boyfriend spoke that made me uneasy. "Do you ever feel like life gets too routine, he asked suddenly, his voice contemplative. Everyone nodded in vague agreement, intrigued by the turn in conversation. Sometimes, he continued, you need to break out of that. Try something different. Something that shakes things up. His words lingered in the air, and then, as if it was the most normal thing in the world, he and his girlfriend began openly discussing their experiences with swinger parties. They spoke casually, as if they were talking about trying a new restaurant or picking up a new hobby. They described how it had transformed their relationship, how it had opened doors and brought excitement in ways they never expected. I kept my face neutral, but internally, I was disgusted. This wasn't the kind of conversation I expected around a campfire with people I barely knew. It wasn't just the topic itself, it was the way they were selling it, as if they were pitching some kind of lifestyle upgrade. And what bothered me most? Laura's reaction. She wasn't just listening, she was completely engrossed. Her eyes were lit up with curiosity, and she was asking questions. Not just polite, casual questions either, genuine, interested ones. It wasn't like her. At least, not like the Laura I thought I knew. Her friend and her boyfriend seemed intrigued as well, chiming in with their own thoughts and questions. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, letting them talk, taking in everything but choosing not to engage. This wasn't the time or place to have an argument, but my mind was already racing. The conversation eventually shifted to other topics, and the lightheartedness returned, but I couldn't unhear what had just been said. I couldn't unsee the way Laura had reacted. As the night wrapped up and we retreated to our tents, the unease lingered. Something had changed. I just didn't know how deep it went yet. The next morning, we packed up and started the hike back down. The atmosphere was still light, but I noticed the way Laura and the new colleague exchanged looks, silent, knowing glances that made my stomach twist. By the time we reached the parking lot, everyone was in high spirits, saying their goodbyes and making plans for the next time we'd all get together. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual. I didn't know exactly what was happening yet, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to like where this was headed. The day after the hike, things seemed normal, on the surface, at least. Laura was in a good mood, chatting away about how much fun she'd had, already tossing around ideas for the next group outing. But I wasn't fooled. Something had shifted. That night, as we sat down for breakfast the next morning, I decided to bring it up. "Listen," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm, "that whole conversation last night about swinger parties? I'm not a fan. Frankly, I find it pretty disgusting." I expected her to nod in agreement, maybe laugh it off, say something like, "Yeah, it was weird, huh?" Instead, she raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "Really?" she mused, stirring her coffee lazily. "You're telling me you've never even been a little curious? Never wondered what it might be like?" Her words landed like a punch to the gut. I put my mug down, staring at her, dumbfounded. "Are you serious?" I asked. "How could I even consider something like that? It's cheating, plain and simple. What are you trying to say by even asking me that?" She held up her hands in mock surrender, still smiling like this was some kind of joke. "Relax," she said. "I'm not saying I want to do it. I was just curious about your reaction. You know how people always say forbidden fruit is the sweetest? Sometimes it's just interesting to think about." I didn't buy it. Not for a second. Her words may have been playful, but the way she looked at me, the way she was testing my reaction, made my stomach twist. And then she dropped another bomb. "Oh, by the way," she said, taking a casual sip of her coffee, "my friend texted me this morning. You won't believe this, but she and her boyfriend actually went to one of those parties last night. Right after the hike." I blinked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "Wait, you're saying they just went for it? Just like that?" Laura nodded, clearly amused by my reaction. "Yep. And guess what? She said it was amazing. That they'd definitely do it again." I stared at her, trying to process this. The idea alone made my skin crawl. And the fact that Laura was sitting here, relaying this to me with barely a hint of discomfort, that made it worse. I focused on my plate, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. Laura, however, seemed completely unbothered. She scrolled through her phone, as if this conversation hadn't just taken a bizarre turn. "Anyway," she said after a moment, I'm meeting up with her for coffee in a couple of days. She wants to tell me all about it." She smiled. "You know, girl talk." I nodded slowly, masking my unease. For now, I'd let her have her coffee date. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something else. And I had a feeling this wasn't the last time we'd be having this conversation. A couple of days later, Laura went out for coffee with her friend. I didn't ask for details. I already had a pretty good idea of what they'd be discussing. Instead, I focused on my own plans for the evening. One of my work buddies had invited me out for a few beers after work, and I figured it'd be a good distraction. After wrapping up my day, I headed to our usual spot, a small, cozy bar not far from the office. By the time I arrived, a couple of the guys were already there, laughing and swapping stories. I grabbed a drink and settled in, letting the conversation flow naturally. It was the usual work banter: clients, deadlines, office gossip. Nothing unusual. Then someone brought up the new hires. "Hey, you've heard about that new girl in Laura's department, right?" one of the guys asked, leaning in slightly. "She's already making waves." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of waves?" He smirked. "Well, there's talk that she's been flirting with people in the office. And get this, she's been inviting them to some kind of, I don't even know what to call it, a lifestyle party." There was a collective chuckle around the table, but the tone was more incredulous than amused. I stiffened, gripping my drink a little tighter. "That's ridiculous," I muttered, shaking my head. "She and her boyfriend came on a hike with us not too long ago, and they were pushing that same nonsense on my wife's friends. It's like they're trying to recruit people into their lifestyle." The laughter at the table faded as the conversation took a more serious tone. "Sounds like trouble," one of the guys said. "If she's pulling that kind of thing at work, it could cause problems for everyone. Honestly, if I were you, I'd keep Laura away from her. You don't want her getting caught up in that mess." The others nodded in agreement, and I took a moment to consider his words. I sighed. It's already bad enough that she's got her friend interested. This whole thing just feels wrong. People are treating it like a joke, but it's not funny when it starts affecting relationships. They all agreed, and the conversation eventually shifted to other topics. But the unease lingered. As the night went on, the group slowly disbanded, and I decided to stay a little longer, nursing my beer and mulling over the conversation. By the time I left, the bar was nearly empty. The drive home was quiet, giving me time to think. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were escalating in a direction I really didn't like. Laura's growing interest in her colleague's lifestyle, coupled with the rumors I just heard, made me uneasy. But I reminded myself, I couldn't jump to conclusions. For now, all I could do was stay vigilant, and keep an eye on how things developed. When I got home that evening, Laura was waiting for me in the living room. She looked excited about something. Her eyes sparkled in a way that made me brace myself for whatever she was about to say. "Guess what?" she began, not waiting for a response. "My colleague is organizing a party," she said, her voice filled with anticipation. "And we're invited. It's going to be amazing. My friend and her boyfriend are coming, too." Her enthusiasm was obvious. But it took me all of 2 seconds to realize exactly what kind of party she was talking about. I didn't hesitate. "You're not going," I said, cutting through her excitement like a blade. Her smile faltered. "What?" "I don't want you hanging around that colleague anymore," I continued, my voice steady. "She's trouble. You know what's happened to our friends because of her influence. I'm not going to let her drag us into the same mess." Laura blinked, clearly taken aback by my bluntness. Then her expression hardened. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Are you seriously telling me who I can and can't be friends with? Do you even hear yourself right now? You're acting like a control freak." She wasn't expecting me to put my foot down. I didn't budge. "Call it what you want," I said firmly, "but I know what's right. And this isn't it. I'm not going to pretend this is normal or acceptable. You've heard the rumors. She's been inviting half the office to these parties. Do you really want to be associated with that?" Laura's frustration boiled over. "This isn't about her," she snapped. "This is about you not trusting me. I can make my own decisions. I don't need you dictating what I can or can't do." She stormed off, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I stood there for a moment, letting the tension settle. I wasn't backing down. I knew I was making the right decision. But her reaction told me one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet. That night, I barely slept. Laura's reaction replayed in my head over and over. Her defensiveness, her anger, the way she made me out to be the problem, it all pointed to one thing. She wasn't just curious about this lifestyle. She was already standing at the edge, debating whether to jump in. The next morning, we barely spoke. She acted normal, as if our argument hadn't happened. But I knew better. The tension sat between us like a ticking bomb. Later that afternoon, my mother called. My dad needed help with some repairs in their garage, and she asked if I could come by for the day. I agreed immediately. Some time away from the house, and from Laura, was exactly what I needed. When I told Laura I'd be gone for the day, she barely looked up from her phone. "Okay," she said casually. "I was thinking of meeting my friend anyway. Might be a good chance to catch up." That set off alarm bells. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice calm. "Just promise me something," I said. "Don't do anything stupid while I'm gone." She raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "You really don't trust me, do you?" "This isn't about trust," I said evenly. "It's about keeping our priorities straight. I care about us. I don't want anything messing with that." She let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes. "Fine. I promise, okay?" But something about the way she said it felt off. Still, I let it go. I wasn't going to argue with her again. Not now. As I drove to my parents' house, I pushed it to the back of my mind. Or at least, I tried to. A few hours into working on my dad's garage, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced down. It was from the group chat with the guys from work. Someone had sent a message. "So, who's actually going to that party tonight?" My stomach dropped. Another message followed. "Supposed to be happening soon. Anyone going?" Most of the responses were jokes or dismissive comments. But then, one guy replied, "I'm single, so why not? I'll go just to see what all the fuss is about." The casual tone of it all made my skin crawl. I locked my phone, trying to shake the unease gnawing at my gut. She wouldn't. She promised. But something in the back of my mind whispered, "Are you sure?" A couple of hours later, as we were wrapping up the garage work, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video message. I hesitated. Then I opened it. The clip was shaky, clearly recorded on a phone. Dim lighting, loud music, people laughing and drinking. The atmosphere looked like a wild house party. Then the camera panned, and my stomach twisted into knots. A flash of a dress. A color and style that looked way too familiar. My chest tightened. Could it be her? I called the guy who sent the video, keeping my voice steady. "Hey," I said. "Do me a favor. Look around. See if my wife's there." He paused. Then, after a moment, "Sure. Give me a minute." I waited, my heart pounding. Then, finally, a response. "Didn't see her. Probably not there." "Relax, man." I stared at the screen, my grip on my phone tightening. "Probably." That wasn't good enough. I finished up with my dad as fast as I could, made my excuses, and got in my car. The entire drive home, my mind raced. The dress. The rumors. The way Laura had acted. Everything was adding up in a way I didn't like. When I pulled into the driveway, my headlights cut through the darkness, and that's when I saw her. Laura was at the front door, fumbling with her keys, barely able to stand. I got out of the car, moving toward her. The moment I got close, the stench of alcohol hit me. And then I noticed something worse. Her dress, the same one from the video, was soaked in some kind of white liquid. It was dripping down her arms, even from her hair. I stopped in my tracks. My stomach turned. She didn't even acknowledge me as she staggered inside, collapsing onto the couch without a word. Within moments, she was out cold. I stood there, staring at her, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it, her phone, lying on the coffee table. I picked it up. The screen lit up. Notifications. Messages. Videos. I hesitated. Then I opened one. And my worst fears were confirmed. Laura was at the party. And it wasn't just a party. She was with 6 different men, some of whom I recognized as her co-workers. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to watch. Not out of some sick curiosity, but because I needed to see. I needed to know the full extent of what she had done. Each video was worse than the last. Every single one was undeniable proof of her betrayal. I transferred the files to my own phone. Not because I wanted them, but because I needed them. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was evidence. I put her phone back on the table and stared at her for a long moment. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I married, was gone. And I wasn't about to let this slide. By morning, the fallout had already begun. Her phone rang, her colleague, screaming on the other end. Words like disgrace, videos, and fired came through, clear as day. Laura sat up, groggy, confused, then panicked. She barely managed to stammer a few words before the call ended. Then she looked at me. Her face crumpled. You did this," she hissed, voice shaking with rage. I met her gaze, calm, steady. "You did this," I corrected. She tried to argue, but I wasn't interested in listening. I gestured toward the front door. "Take your things and go." Her face twisted with disbelief. "You can't be serious." But I was. Her bags were already packed, waiting by the door. She gathered them up, furious, humiliated, but powerless to argue. And then, just like that, she was gone. The divorce process was fast and simple. With the video proof I had, she had nothing to stand on. No way to fight back. She lost her job, her reputation, everything. And me. I walked away without looking back. A few weeks later, I got a call from an old friend, one of the guys who had been wrapped up in all this mess. "I just wanted to say thank you," he admitted. "Because of what you did, I took a long, hard look at my own life. I almost got pulled into the same thing. But you woke me up. I didn't set out to change anyone's life. But I did set out to protect my own. And that was enough for me. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Thank you for visited my YouTube channel. Your support, likes, and comments truly inspire me to create even more engaging content. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. You're a part of this amazing community, and I'm thrilled to share my stories with you. See you in the next video on YouTube.